Right now, most people looking at XRP are focused on the wrong idea. They believe a low price means it is better for adoption, and a high price means it is too late to enter. But what if the reality is completely opposite to what retail investors think? What if banks actually benefit more when XRP becomes expensive rather than cheap? And what if the entire system of global payments is designed in a way where price is not just a number on a chart, but a function of liquidity, speed, and settlement efficiency? And if you understand this early, you start to see why major financial institutions may not see XRP the same way retail investors do, because the deeper structure of how money moves globally changes everything you think you know about value, usage, and demand. To understand why banks might actually need XRP to be expensive, the first thing that needs to be clear is the biggest misunderstanding retail investors have about digital assets in general, especially XRP. Most retail thinking is built around a simple idea that lower price is always better because it allows more people to buy, and higher price is always dangerous because it reduces accessibility. This logic works in traditional investing mindset, but it does not fully apply when an asset is being used as a liquidity bridge in a global financial system. XRP is not designed to function like a normal stock or a simple store of value where people just buy and hold, hoping for price appreciation. Instead, its primary purpose is to act as a bridge asset that helps move money instantly between two different currencies without needing pre funded accounts across borders. This is where the misunderstanding begins because when people think about XRP, they often think about how many coins they can accumulate. But banks think about how efficiently value can move through the system with minimal friction and minimal capital locked in different regions. Now, in traditional banking systems, cross border payments require large amounts of liquidity to be locked in different countries in what is called nostro and vostro accounts. This means banks have to keep money sitting idle in multiple currencies around the world just to make transactions possible when needed. This is inefficient, expensive, and slow. The idea behind using a bridge asset like XRP is to reduce or eliminate this need by allowing instant conversion between currencies through a single liquidity path. At this point, price starts to become more important than most retail investors realize. If XRP is too cheap, it means that a very large amount of tokens must be used to facilitate even small liquidity flows. This creates inefficiency in terms of settlement depth and transactional stability. However, if XRP is at a higher value, fewer units are required to move the same amount of money across borders. This reduces friction and increases liquidity efficiency, which is exactly what financial institutions prioritize. Banks do not think in terms of how many coins can I buy, they think in terms of how much value can be moved per unit of liquidity. In that context, a higher value per unit of XRP actually becomes more efficient for large scale settlement systems. This is where retail thinking starts to break down because retail assumes that expensive means less useful, while institutional systems often see expensive assets as more capital efficient. Another important aspect that is often ignored is that liquidity depth and network efficiency are deeply connected to price stability and valuation. When an asset is too cheap, it can create volatility and inefficiency in how it is used as a settlement layer because the volume of units required becomes too large to handle smoothly in real time global transactions. But when an asset reaches a certain level of valuation, it becomes easier to integrate into large scale financial flows because it reduces operational complexity. This is why the conversation around XRP is not just about whether it will go up or down in price, but about what level of price makes it functionally optimal for the system it is designed to support. Retail investors often miss this because they are focused on accumulation strategies, while institutional systems are focused on optimization of liquidity movement. So, when we start asking why banks might actually prefer XRP to be expensive, we are really asking a deeper question about how global liquidity infrastructure works and how value per unit affects efficiency in cross border settlement systems. Once this foundation is understood, the entire narrative around XRP begins to shift from speculation based thinking to utility based reasoning. And that is where the real complexity of the topic begins to unfold. When we move deeper into how banks actually operate, the idea of price starts to look very different from what retail investors usually assume. In traditional thinking, price is often seen as a barrier, something that makes an asset more expensive to acquire and therefore less attractive. But in institutional finance, especially in global settlement systems, price is not only about cost, it is also about efficiency, liquidity depth, and how much value can move through a system with the least amount of friction. To understand this better, imagine how money normally moves between countries today. If a bank in one country wants to send money to another country, it usually relies on a network of pre funded accounts and intermediary banks. This means money is locked in different places around the world so that transactions can be processed quickly when needed. This system works, but it is slow, expensive, and heavily dependent on trust between multiple parties. Now, introduce a bridge asset like XRP into this system. Instead of locking money in multiple countries, value can be converted into XRP, moved instantly, and then converted into the destination currency within seconds. This removes the need for pre funding and reduces capital inefficiency. But here is where price becomes an important factor that most retail investors do not consider carefully. If XRP is very cheap, then moving large amounts of value requires a huge number of units. This sounds good from a retail perspective because it feels like you can own a large quantity of coins, but for institutional systems, it creates operational challenges. Handling extremely large quantities of units in real time settlement systems increases complexity and can reduce smoothness in execution. Banks do not want systems that require handling billions or trillions of tiny units every second. They want systems that are clean, efficient, and easy to integrate into existing financial infrastructure. When the value per unit of XRP increases, something interesting happens. The same amount of money can be moved using fewer units of the asset. This reduces the operational load on systems that are already managing massive global transaction flows. In other words, higher price can actually make the asset more efficient as a bridge for liquidity. And this is where retail thinking and institutional thinking start to diverge sharply. Retail investors usually assume that if price goes up, accessibility goes down, and therefore usage becomes harder. But banks do not operate on accessibility in the same way individuals do. They operate on liquidity efficiency and capital optimization. If a system allows them to move the same value with less friction, fewer units, and faster settlement times, then higher value per unit becomes an advantage rather than a disadvantage. Another important factor is liquidity depth. For an asset to function as a global bridge, it needs strong liquidity pools that can handle large transfers without causing instability in price movement. When value per unit is higher, liquidity providers can manage large flows more efficiently because the same transaction volume represents fewer units moving through the system. This improves stability and reduces the stress on liquidity markets. There is also a psychological layer in institutional adoption that is often overlooked. Banks and financial institutions are not interested in speculative narratives. They are interested in systems that reduce cost, increase speed, and improve reliability. If an asset can perform those functions more effectively at a higher valuation, then price becomes a reflection of utility rather than speculation. This is why some analysts argue that XRP does not need to remain cheap in order to achieve mass adoption in institutional finance. In fact, a certain level of higher valuation may actually be required for it to function efficiently at global scale. The idea is not about making it expensive for the sake of price growth, but about reaching a level where the asset becomes structurally optimized for high volume financial movement. At this stage of understanding, it becomes clearer why the retail perspective of cheap equals better does not fully align with how global payment systems are designed. Banks are not trying to collect assets the way individuals do. They are trying to move billions across borders in seconds with minimal friction. And in that environment, the efficiency of each unit of liquidity matters more than how many units exist in circulation. This leads us to a deeper realization that XRP's value discussion is not just about market speculation, but about structural design in global finance. And once this is understood, the conversation shifts again into a more advanced layer of how settlement systems actually determine value in real world usage rather than retail expectations. As the discussion goes deeper, it becomes important to understand how real world payment systems actually behave when they are scaled to global levels. Banks and financial institutions are not dealing with small retail transactions. They are handling massive cross border flows that require speed, consistency, and strong liquidity support at all times. In this environment, the role of a bridge asset is not just about moving money, but about maintaining stability while large volumes of value are constantly shifting across different currencies and regions. One of the key systems often discussed in relation to XRP is on demand liquidity, where value is sourced in real time instead of being pre funded in different countries. This approach removes the need for idle capital sitting in foreign accounts and replaces it with a dynamic liquidity model that responds instantly to demand. However, for such a system to function smoothly at a global level, the efficiency of each unit of liquidity becomes extremely important. If the value of XRP is too low, then every transaction requires a very large number of units to be moved across the network. While this may not seem like a problem at first, it creates unnecessary pressure on liquidity systems when scaled globally. Large financial institutions are not just processing a few transactions, they are handling thousands or even millions of value transfers across multiple corridors at the same time. In such a system, handling excessive unit volume can reduce efficiency and increase operational complexity. When the value per unit of XRP increases, the entire system becomes more streamlined. Fewer units are required to represent the same amount of transferred value, which reduces friction in settlement processes. This allows liquidity providers and financial institutions to operate more smoothly because the asset becomes more efficient in representing large scale monetary value. In simple terms, higher value per unit can actually make global transfers cleaner and easier to manage. Another important factor is liquidity depth across trading pairs. For a bridge asset to function effectively, it must maintain strong liquidity between multiple currencies. When XRP is used as an intermediary asset, it is constantly being exchanged between different fiat pairs. If the asset is too cheap, the volume of units required for large transactions becomes extremely high, which can stress liquidity pools and create inefficiencies in execution. But when the asset holds higher value, liquidity depth becomes more concentrated, making it easier to execute large transfers without disrupting market balance. It is also important to understand how volatility interacts with liquidity systems. Banks prefer stability above everything else because unpredictable fluctuations can create risk in settlement timing and value accuracy. A higher valuation does not necessarily mean higher volatility. In fact, when an asset reaches a more mature and widely adopted level of usage, its price behavior can become more stable due to stronger liquidity participation and deeper market structure. In a global payment network, stability is not just about price staying flat, it is about ensuring that large transfers can happen without causing sudden disruption in the system. If an asset has deeper liquidity and stronger market support at higher valuation levels, it can actually absorb large transactions more effectively. This is one of the reasons why institutional systems often value depth and efficiency over simple affordability. Another important element is capital efficiency. Financial institutions aim to reduce the amount of capital locked in inactive positions. If a bridge asset allows them to move large value using fewer units, it frees up capital that can be used elsewhere in the financial system. This improves overall efficiency and reduces wasted liquidity. In this context, higher unit value is not a disadvantage, but a way to optimize how capital flows across global networks. It is also worth noting that global settlement systems are not designed for retail participation at their core level. They are designed for institutional use cases where billions of dollars are moving across borders every day. In that environment, the focus is not on how many units a person can hold, but on how effectively value can be transferred without delay or unnecessary cost. When all of these factors are combined, liquidity efficiency, capital optimization, settlement speed, and system stability, it becomes clearer why the idea of XRP needing to be cheap does not fully align with how global financial infrastructure actually operates. Instead, there is a strong argument that a higher valuation may support more efficient usage within large scale payment systems. This shifts the entire perspective away from retail accumulation thinking and toward functional utility within global finance. And as this understanding develops further, it becomes even more important to explore how institutional demand, market structure, and liquidity design all interact to shape long term value behavior. As we go deeper into how global financial systems actually function, another important layer appears that retail investors often overlook completely, and that is the role of institutional demand combined with liquidity providers. In a system designed for cross border payments, value does not move randomly. It follows structured corridors where financial institutions, banks, and liquidity providers all play specific roles in ensuring that transactions settle smoothly and without delay. In this kind of environment, a bridge asset like XRP is not just a speculative instrument sitting on an exchange chart, it becomes part of a larger liquidity framework. That framework depends heavily on how much value can be moved at any given moment and how efficiently that value can pass through different currency pairs. When institutions start relying on a shared liquidity asset, demand begins to shift from retail driven speculation to utility driven usage. Liquidity providers are a key part of the system because they supply the actual asset that allows transactions to happen instantly. They are not buying XRP because they believe in short term price movement. They are holding and supplying it because they are compensated for providing liquidity across different corridors. This creates a continuous requirement for sufficient liquidity depth in the market. If demand for cross border settlement increases, liquidity providers need more of the asset available to meet that demand efficiently. This is where the idea of price starts to take on a different meaning again. When an asset is used heavily in institutional liquidity systems, its value tends to reflect not just speculation, but the actual demand for settlement capacity. If global payment corridors begin to rely more on a bridge asset, then the need for that asset increases in proportion to transaction volume. However, instead of simply increasing supply endlessly, the system naturally adjusts through valuation and liquidity concentration. In simple terms, higher demand for settlement efficiency can create upward pressure on value because the system needs enough liquidity strength to support large scale transfers. If the asset remains too cheap while demand grows, it can create inefficiencies in liquidity Distribution, because more units are needed to handle the same level of global movement. This is not just a technical issue, it becomes a structural limitation when scaling across multiple financial corridors. Another important concept is settlement finality. In global payments, once a transaction is completed, it must be final and irreversible within seconds. For this to work efficiently, the bridge asset must have strong liquidity backing so that value does not fluctuate significantly during the settlement process. A higher value per unit can actually help stabilize this process because it reduces the number of units required for large transactions, making execution cleaner and more predictable. There is also an indirect relationship between adoption and scarcity dynamics. While XRP is not scarce in the traditional sense, like a fixed supply commodity, its effective circulating liquidity in active settlement channels can behave like a constrained resource when demand increases rapidly. If more institutions begin using it simultaneously for cross border flows, the available liquidity in active markets becomes more important than total supply. This creates a situation where demand pressure is focused on usable liquidity rather than total token count. Another layer to consider is how modern financial messaging standards and banking systems are evolving toward faster, more automated settlement infrastructure. As global systems move toward real time payments and standardized financial communication frameworks, the need for efficient bridge assets becomes more relevant. In such a system, assets that can reduce settlement time and improve capital efficiency naturally become more valuable within the network they serve. What is often misunderstood is that institutional systems do not aim to suppress value, they aim to optimize flow. If a certain value level of an asset allows the system to function more efficiently, that level becomes structurally supported by usage rather than speculation. This is why discussions around XRP often include the idea that its valuation is tied to utility at scale, not just market sentiment. When all of these elements come together, liquidity providers, institutional demand, corridor based usage, and settlement efficiency, it becomes clear that price is not just an external number influenced by retail trading. Instead, it becomes a reflection of how much pressure the system places on the asset to perform its role in real time global value transfer. And as this pressure increases, the system naturally adjusts in a way that supports efficiency, even if that means higher valuation levels over time. This leads into the final layer of understanding, where risk, market behavior, and financial responsibility must also be considered before drawing conclusions about long term expectations. When everything is put together, the discussion around why banks might need XRP to be expensive is not about hype or guaranteed outcomes. It is about understanding how global financial systems prioritize efficiency over perception. But at the same time, it is equally important to step back and understand the real market environment, because no financial system operates in isolation and no asset moves in a straight line without risk, uncertainty, and changing conditions. Even if XRP is designed or positioned as a bridge asset for liquidity, its real world behavior is still influenced by multiple forces at the same time. These include regulatory developments, institutional adoption speed, technological integration, global economic conditions, and overall market liquidity. This means that while theoretical utility may suggest one direction of long term value alignment, actual price movement in the market can still remain unpredictable in the short and medium term. Retail investors often make the mistake of assuming that utility automatically leads to immediate price increase, but financial systems do not work on instant reflection. Adoption takes time, integration takes years, and infrastructure changes in banking systems move at a very slow and carefully controlled pace. This is why even assets with strong use cases can remain undervalued or stagnant for long periods before any major shift becomes visible in price action. Another important factor is that markets are influenced by sentiment cycles. Even if an asset has strong long term potential, short term price behavior is often driven by speculation, liquidity events, and broader market trends such as risk on or risk off environments. This means that retail thinking based on excitement or expectation can often clash with the slower and more structured reality of institutional adoption. It is also important to understand that financial institutions do not operate based on maximizing price for any single asset. Their goal is system efficiency, cost reduction, and reliability of settlement infrastructure. If a bridge asset like XRP becomes part of that system, its value is determined by how effectively it supports those goals, not by retail demand alone. However, increased usage in institutional systems can indirectly influence long term valuation pressure, but this process is gradual and depends on scale of adoption. Risk management is another critical part of this conversation. Any financial asset, especially in the crypto space, carries volatility risk, regulatory uncertainty, and market structure limitations. Even assets with strong theoretical utility are not immune to sudden market corrections or long periods of sideways movement. This is why professional investors always focus on risk exposure, diversification, and time horizon rather than emotional expectations about price targets. There is also a misunderstanding that if banks benefit from a higher valuation, it automatically guarantees that such a valuation will be achieved quickly or in a straight path. In reality, financial systems evolve slowly, and adoption happens in phases. Early stages may show limited visible impact on price, even if behind the scenes infrastructure is being built and tested. The final truth that often gets missed in retail discussions is that value in financial systems is not just created by demand, but by necessity, efficiency, and integration depth. If an asset becomes deeply embedded into global payment infrastructure, its valuation will eventually reflect that role, but only over time and under conditions where usage is consistent and scalable. At the same time, no outcome is guaranteed, and market participants should always approach such narratives with balanced expectations. Understanding utility is important, but so is recognizing uncertainty. A rational approach involves observing adoption trends, liquidity development, and institutional integration while also respecting market volatility and external risks. So, when the question is asked why banks might need XRP to be expensive, the deeper answer is not a simple prediction of price, but an explanation of how global liquidity systems function and how efficiency can influence valuation over long periods. However, the market itself remains complex, influenced by multiple forces that cannot be controlled or fully predicted. For viewers and readers, the most important takeaway is to avoid emotional decision making and instead focus on understanding the structure behind the narrative. Awareness of how institutional systems think is valuable, but it should always be combined with careful risk management and realistic expectations about how markets behave over time. Financial disclaimer: this content is for educational and informational purposes only and should not be considered financial advice. Cryptocurrency markets are highly volatile and involve significant risk. Always do your own research and consult with a qualified financial advisor before making any investment decisions. If you found this breakdown helpful, consider staying informed, staying cautious, and continuing to build your understanding of how global financial systems are evolving over time.